This is Greek with David Hutchison. Participles. Participles are verbal adjectives. They're hybrids. They're part verb, that's the first half, and they're part adjective, the second half. A participle is a verb stem with adjective endings. A verb stem with adjective endings. We want to explore the way in which participles function today. Sometimes their functions will focus more on the adjectival side, and sometimes they'll focus more on the verbal side. Under the adjectival side, a participle can act like an adjective. It can also act like a noun. So both of these subcategories would be under the adjectival side of the participle. Under the verbal side, you could have a participle acting like an adverb, so it's adverbial. And then there are other verbal ideas that aren't purely adverbial, but they are verbal. So you'll see what we mean when we get there. So let's look first at when the participle functions like an adjective. Under this category of adjectival participles, we're going to look at attributive participles and predicate participles. Basically, all participles are going to do under these categories is just act like an adjective. So if you took everything you knew about an adjective, you could say, oh yeah, participles can do that too. The first thing we think of with an adjective is an attributive adjective, and this is the first use of a participle we want to see, an attributive participle. This simply attributes a quality to a noun. Usually, but not always, but usually this participle will have an article, and it does have to be in the attributive position. One of these positions is article participle noun, the participle noun, just like the tall boy, the participle noun. The other position that's pretty common is the noun, the participle, article noun, article participle, just like article noun, article adjective. An attributive participle will agree with the noun it modifies in case, in gender, and in number. Attributive participles will often be translated like a relative clause, a who, a which, or that clause. James 1:5, Eide tis humon lepetai Sophias, aiteto para tu didontos theou. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask from the giving God. I've translated that one kind of in the normal adjectival way, the adjective noun, the giving God. But what you'll see is this is often translated as the God who gives. The God who gives. And of course it goes on to characterize this God who gives. I'm reminded when we think about asking God for wisdom that James says we must not doubt. But if you think about it, there's no reason to doubt. I used to ask God for a Camaro Z28. That was a selfish prayer. There are a lot of reasons why God would not answer that prayer, least of which it's pretty hard to get into a Camaro Z28. But if I ask for wisdom, why would God not want to give me that request? Because if I ask for wisdom, I become more like Him. So that's a prayer God wants to answer. So there's zero reason for us to doubt that God will give us wisdom if we ask for it. Matthew 6:18, Kai ha pater su ha blepon in to kruphaio apadose soi. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. This is that second attributive position, the noun, the participle. The noun, the participle. Your Father, which Father? the seeing father, the father who sees in secret. So these are attributive participles. Another thing an adjective can do is be a predicate adjective, and so a participle can be a predicate participle. This will complete a being verb. Remember, the being verb can be there, it can be actually present in the text, or it can simply be implied. A predicate participle never has an article. Zongar halagos tu theou. For the word of God is living. Just as if this were a predicate adjective, the word of God is great. We have a participle sitting in that place. For the word of God is living. It's zone. Another one with zone from Revelation 1:18. Eginame nekros kai edu zone emi. I was dead, and behold, I am living, completing that being verb emi. The second use we want to look at is a substantival participle. This is when a participle acts like a noun. It doesn't modify a noun, but it acts like a noun. This one can have an article. I think it very frequently will, but it doesn't have to. Here's one that's the subject of the verb poie. Pas ha gegene minos ek tu theou hamartian u poie. Everyone who has been born of God does not keep on sinning, does not practice sin. So the participle is the subject of this verb poie. Now on this verse, I think this is one place where the ongoing nature of the present tense can really play an important factor. It's not just that this person never sins, period. And 1 John tells us earlier in the book that if you say you don't sin, you're a liar. So why is it that he would say something like this? It's probably if you keep on sinning. If this is your lifestyle, if you are characterized by nothing but sin, then you have not indeed been born of God. But the one who has been born of God doesn't keep on sinning. Matthew 5:44, this one is going to be the object of a preposition, huper. Proseukiste huper ton, diokanton humas. Pray for those who are persecuting you. So basically anything that a noun could do, a participle could do if it's acting like a noun. These are just a couple of examples, but we could do direct object, we could do a genitive phrase, just anything you could imagine a noun doing, a participle could pretty well do as well. The next big category that we want to consider is adverbial. This is under the verbal side, and you might think of adverbial proper. The participle would answer a question about time, or means, manner, cause, the word because, condition, with the word if, concession, with the word although, purpose, to or in order to, or result, with the result that. Now let me go ahead and encourage you. I'm going to give you some keywords when we look at all of these categories. Make a list and use these keywords to test out the sense of a participle. See if it fits any of these categories. It's important to remember that an adverbial participle never has an article. So if you see a participle and it has an article, then you know for sure it's not adverbial. It would either be acting like an adjective or it would be acting like a noun. So let's start with temporal participles. The time with participles is related to the time of the main verb. You could say that this time is relative time because it relates to the time of the main verb. Present tense participles will happen at the same time. Present tense equals same time. Same time is the main verb. Aorist participles or perfect participles, those happen before the main verb. So aorist participle or perfect participle equals prior time. There are a few future participles. They're not very common, but future tense participles happen in a future point. They happen after the main verb. They're future focused on the timeline. Those are pretty rare though. So let's imagine a timeline here. So here you see the middle dot representing the main verb. A present tense participle would happen at the same time. We could move that main verb dot forward or backwards. Doesn't matter. The present tense participle happens at the same time. An aorist or perfect tense participle happens at a prior time. And I didn't put future on here just because it's so infrequent, but the future tense would be to the right of that main verb. So a present tense participle happens at the same time as the verb. Kai paragon Aiden luin ton tu alphaiou. And while going on, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus. So you can translate a present tense participle that's temporal. You can do it with the translation of while. So it happens at the same time. Now, when did the main verb happen? Well, this one happens to be aorist, so it happened at some point in the past, but the present tense participle happened at the same time. Aorist or perfect tense participles happen before the main verb, prior time. Occasionally, you will see an exception where the aorist participle happens at the same time as an aorist main verb. So we'll look at one of each of these. Here's one where aorist participle happens before the main verb. Katharismon ton hamartion poesamenos ekathesin. After making purification for sins, he sat down. This is referring to Jesus' post-resurrection session with the Father. He sits at the Father's right hand, the place of authority with the Father's right hand. By the way, when do you sit down? When you're finished working. So this didn't happen while he was making purification for sins, but it happened after that. Context helps us here. Here's one where the aorist tense participle happens at the same time. Kai idon ha Jesus ten piston auton apento paralutiko. In seeing their faith, when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, to the paralyzed man, this one is happening at the same time. What he's about to say to him occurs simultaneously with seeing their faith. So if you had a present tense participle, you could do while. If you have an aorist participle, you can sometimes say after, and sometimes you can say while or when. You have to let context help you. A participle can also tell you the means by which something is accomplished. Participles will answer the how question. How did you do it? You might use by or by means of in your translation. Hamarton, paradus haima athoon. I have sinned. How? By betraying innocent blood. So see if the participle answers this how question. By means of what? So if it answers the how question, it can be means. A similar one is called manner. This tells you the manner in which something was accomplished, not the means by which something is accomplished. It still answers the how question, but this one is more of the manner in which something is done, the flavor, the color, the style. It is less common than means. So, eporuanta kairantes. They went on their way rejoicing. It tells you how they went on their way, but kind of with what sort of an attitude or with what sort of an activity. They went on their way rejoicing. If this were means, it would have said something like, they went on their way by riding a horse. So the riding a horse tells you the means by which they accomplished it. participle can tell you the cause or the reason for the action of the main verb, answering the question why. You might use since or because. Acts 9, this is where we meet a fellow that was a pretty bad candidate to be a missionary. Pontes ephobunta auton, me pistuantes hati estin mathetes. They were all afraid of him, not believing that he was a disciple. Why were they afraid? Because, or since, they did not believe that he was a disciple. So this answers that why question. Of course, we're talking about Paul, who turns out to be one of the greatest missionaries the world has ever known. So never doubt the power of God. Now also at the very end of this sentence, notice that it's the being verb estin, the present tense, not believing that he is a disciple. This is another example of indirect discourse, where it's kind of this reported speech or reported thought. And remember that in English, we tend to push it back, so that's why translations will say he was a disciple, rather than saying not believing that he is a disciple. You can have a conditional participle. A conditional participle tells you something about the condition on which the fulfillment of the verb depends. So the conditional idea is if, Galatians 6:9, therissamen me ekluomenoi, we shall reap if we don't lose heart. Or here's one from the Gospels. Te gar apheletai anthropos kerdesas ton kosmon holon heauton de apolesas e zemiothes. For what does it profit a man gaining the whole world but losing or forfeiting himself? You see this if idea. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses or forfeits himself? The parallel account in the Gospels actually uses the word if with a subjunctive. So you can see the similar type of thing that you can do with a participle. It's this if idea. There's also a participle that can do an although idea. We would call this concession. The verb is true or takes place despite the action of the participle. This is the opposite of cause. It's not because, it's although or even though. Romans 1:21 is a good example. Gnantes ton theon, uk hos theon edoxason. Although they knew God, they did not honor him as God. Even though they knew it, they did not give him glory. Purpose. A participle can give the purpose of the action of the verb. This answers why, but it's forward-looking. So you might use to, in order to, so that, for the purpose of. It's not because. Because is backwards-looking, and purpose is forward-looking. Kai idu, namakastis aneste, ek peiradzon auton. And behold, a certain lawyer stood up. Why? To test him, for the purpose of testing him. This never turned out so well, did it? You can have a participle that gives you the result. What is the actual outcome or the result of the main verb? Luke 4:15, autos edidaskin in tais synagogais auton, doxadzomenos hypaponton. He taught in their synagogues with the result that he was glorified by all. He taught in their synagogues being glorified by all. So to test it out, see if you can add with the result that. And if it makes good sense, then you have a participle of result. So in all of these adverbial participles, take those key words, make a list, put it on paper, and keep it next to your desk while you translate, and test out a participle to see if it fits these categories. There are some other participles that are under the larger umbrella of verbal, but they're not adverbial proper. These are things like Attendant Circumstance, a redundant participle, Genitive Absolute, a Complementary participle, Imperatival Participles, and Periphrastic Constructions. So this first one that we call a participle of Attendant Circumstance, you can think of this as a piggybacking participle. What this does is it's a participle that piggybacks on the main verb, and it is almost coordinate with the main verb. It's often going to be translated like a main verb, and then you're going to use the word and. So I might have going, tell your mother we're home. The way you would translate that most of the time is go and tell your mother we're at home. But if you translated it very literally, it would be going, tell your mother we're at home. That participle going kind of piggybacks on that main verb. Now it's important to remember a verbal participle is still dependent on the main verb. And so the main verb still has more focus than the participle, but this participle is approaching the main verb in terms of its significance. But it's still not the big point. The big point will be the main verb. The slightly less emphatic point will be the participle. There are some regular features of these participles, and if all of these criteria are not met, you have to be somewhat suspicious. So you'll see these with aorist participles, an aorist main verb, either an imperative or an indicative main verb. The participle comes first. It precedes the main verb. And you'll see this frequently in narrative literature. So if you don't see all of these features, you might want to think twice before you call one of these an attendant circumstance participle. Let me show you a few, and I think you'll get the idea. Aphintes panta, a kaleutheson auto. First, I'll just do it pretty literally. Leaving everything, they followed him. Leaving everything, they followed him. But that participle kind of piggybacks on the main verb followed, so it's often translated, they left everything and followed him. So you translate it kind of like you translate the main verb. They left everything and they followed him. Here's one where the main verb is an imperative, a command. Poreuthentes de mathete te estin, Elias thelo kai ou thusion. Going, learn what is, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Going, learn. It's often translated, go and learn what this means. Go and learn what this means. And now one that's more controversial. Matthew 28:19, the first part of the Great Commission. Poreuthentes un mathetusete panta ta ethne. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. Why do I say controversial? If this is an attendant circumstance participle, it does have some of that imperatival force that mathetusete has. Go and make disciples. But what if it's merely a temporal participle? While you go, make disciples. So you may see people disagreeing about which sense is most prevalent here. Is it as you go, make disciples? Or is it go and make disciples. Whichever side you come down on, do remember that piggybacking participle takes on some of the force of the main verb, but still the main verb is the most important thing. So how would you preach this text? That's what we're really getting at. The main point of the passage is not go, but the main point of the passage is make disciples. So you have, looking forward in the text, you basically have one main point with three subpoints. The main point is make disciples. Subpoint number one is go. It's either as you go if it's temporal, or it's somewhat imperatival if it's this attendant circumstance, go and make. But the main point is make disciples. It doesn't matter if you're here, there, or everywhere. Wherever you are, make disciples. Subpoint 1 is the going. Subpoint 2, from later in the text, baptizing. Subpoint 3 is the teaching. So by the way, Greek can certainly help you outline a text. Main point of the sermon, main point of the Bible study, make disciples. Subpoint 1, go. Subpoint 2, baptize. Subpoint 3, teach. There's another one that's from the Department of Redundancy department that we would call a redundant participle, or a fancy word is the pleonastic participle. This occurs very often with a verb of saying or thanking, along with a similar main verb. In English, this often gets translated just with one verb. This is very frequent in the Gospels. Kai apokrithes, ha Jesus lege autois, ekete piston theou. And answering, Jesus said to them. Historical present, by the way. In answering, Jesus said to them. It's often translated, Jesus answered and said, or sometimes people would just translate it, Jesus answered, because it's redundant. That's the difference between the one we just saw, the attendant circumstance participle, and this one that's a redundant participle, is that the participle is basically the exact same idea as the main verb, so it's redundant. There is something called a genitive absolute. What happens here, normally the subject of a participle, the person doing the activity of the participle, will be the same subject as the rest of the sentence. And so that subject is going to be nominative. This is why so many participles, by the way, are nominative. But if you ever need to specify a different subject than the subject of the main verb, Greek had a way of doing that. What you would do is you would put that subject in the genitive, and then the participle would also be genitive. So it's called a genitive absolute because the word absolute means something like loosed. It's loosed from normal boundaries or guidelines. Normally we expect a nominative subject, but what we can do in this type of case is we can have a genitive subject of a genitive participle. So John 8:30. Tauta autou laluntas paloi epistuson eis auton. So autou is genitive. Laluntas is also genitive. The main subject is paloi, that's nominative, and then the main verb is epistuson. So the many believed, but the many weren't the ones speaking. So I need a different subject for that participle speaking. So I put the subject and I put the participle in the genitive. This is a genitive absolute. You can also have a complementary participle. This is a participle that completes the idea of the verb that it goes with. This is something that normally you would expect an infinitive to do, but rarely you can see a participle doing this. Hoste epauseta lalon. As he finished speaking, if I didn't have that participle there, as he finished, you'd say, well, he finished what? This kind of answers that question. It just completes that idea of the verb. As he finished speaking, or one from Ephesians 1:16, ou pauomai euchariston huper humon. I do not cease giving thanks for you. I don't cease what? Well, then that participle completes the verb. So we would call it a complementary participle. Sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, a participle can function like a command, like an imperative. A moment ago, when we studied attendant circumstance participles, we saw those piggybacking participles that kind of acted like an imperative, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a participle that's all on its own, and it's acting like an imperative. A lot of these examples are in Romans 12 and 1 Peter. Te elpidi kairentes, rejoicing in hope, but it has this imperatival force, so it's just translated rejoice in hope. Te thlipse hupamenontes, endure in tribulation. Te prosuke proskarteruntes, be devoted to prayer. All of those are participles, but they seem to have an imperatival force, so they're translated as if they were imperatives. Now, the last thing we want to look at is a periphrastic construction. This is where you have a being verb, usually a form of a me, plus a participle to say what you could have said just with a regular old verb. It's a roundabout way of saying something, so that's why it's called periphrastic. Wallace says that in earlier Greek literature, before the New Testament literature, the reason that this was done was to place a greater significance on aspect. In his view, some of this aspectual significance was diminishing and almost null by the time of the New Testament. Others would maintain that the aspect is still prominent even in the New Testament period. In these constructions, the participle is almost always nominative, and it usually follows the verb. So this chart will show you what some of the constructions are that we can see. On the left side, we have a form of a me, and sometimes some other verbs. Then we have the participle, and then what it's equivalent to if it were a normal finite verb. So you could have a present tense of a me plus a present participle. That's just equivalent to a present tense verb. If I had an imperfect verb plus a present participle, this acts like it's imperfect. A future being verb plus a present participle acts like future. So all three of those with the present tense participle, they just act like the being verb acts. So let's use the word talk as an example. I am talking. I was talking. I will talk. So those are really pretty intuitive. You can have a present tense being verb with a perfect tense participle that just acts like a perfect tense verb. You can combine an imperfect being verb plus a perfect participle. This acts like a pluperfect. And it's rare, but we'll go ahead and add it to the chart. A future tense being verb plus a perfect participle that acts like a future perfect verb. So my advice to you here, don't worry about trying to memorize this chart. Just know where it is in your book or in your notes so that when you run across one of these, you know what to do. Let's see a few of these. Colossians 1:6, kathos kai in panti to kosmo estin karpaphorumenon. So there's the present tense being verb with the present tense participle. It is bearing fruit. I could have just done this with a regular verb, but instead the author chose to use a roundabout way of doing it, so it's called a periphrastic way, a periphrastic construction. Ein didaskon autus. Imperfect being verb plus present tense participle. He was teaching them. And then one with present tense being verb and a perfect tense participle. Te gar chariti este sesos menoi. For by grace you have been saved, or you are saved. This one comes down to a perfect tense. What's the sense being expressed? Is it focusing more on the past action or more on the resulting state? But so all three of these are roundabout ways of saying what could have been said with just a normal finite verb.